Hello and welcome to the Digital Services Coalition's 2023 webinar series, Defining Digital. My name is Gaurav Gupta and I am the Director of Engineering at Kind Systems. And I would like to welcome you to what I believe will be a fun and enlightening conversation on differentiating between prototypes, pilots, and MVPs. Just a couple of reminders for webinar. Everyone has been muted upon entry and this webinar is being recorded. So please try not to interrupt others when they're speaking and avoid distracting the audience. Please feel free to ask questions utilizing the chat feature in Zoom. This webinar is hosted by Kind. Kind is a consultancy focused on civic tech, legal tech, and SaaS. We are a fully remote team of software engineers, product folks, and consultants who bring cross-functional skills to solve impactful governmental and societal problems in a pragmatic way. I'm joined by my co-host, Josh.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Josh Mills. I'm with Kind Systems. I've been working in government tech for about a year and a half now. Most of my experience with the VA, I started on the facilities team, did a little bit of time with the public websites team, and I'm currently working on accelerated publishing there.
Thank you, Josh. The Digital Services Coalition, abbreviated as the DSC, is a collection of agile technology and design firms that serve or aspire to serve the government. We're working hard on our mission to be a trusted partner of the digital service community by having timely and relevant discussions and publishing educational material. Today is our fourth event in the Defining Digital series, intended to meet one of the DSC's strategic goals of creating a shared language between industry and government around the terms most commonly used or misused in digital services.
We are doing this in three parts. The first is a webinar to learn from industry and government why these terms are important and how they are best used and described. This is what you are all attending now. Following today's presentation, we'll be hosting a workshop. This will be a hybrid in-person workshop in Washington, D.C. on Thursday, November 16th to craft a description of best practices that work for both government and industry. Registration for the free workshop is open now, and continuing education credits will be provided if needed. The link will be sent as a follow-up to the email after this panel concludes. We'll also have a link and QR code on the last slide. And finally, continuing education, where we use results of this workshop and webinar as the basis for future skill building, blogs, conversations, and in practical applications. We are doing this in iterations, so if you can't make it to an event for one term or concept, there will be others throughout the year. We're not sure what the final end product will look like, but we will be getting feedback through these sessions as to what will be most useful to both industry and government.
One of the most important things for this webinar series is to have a great panel of experts in the field. The panel we have today represents an esteemed group of folks working in government, industry, and those who are making a career of working in both sectors. It is my pleasure to welcome our panelists. I would like each of our panelists to introduce themselves, starting with Mark.
Oh, thank you. So hello, my name is Mark. I have been a software engineer since 2009-ish. I have primarily worked for most of my career in the startup world. So I've had to dip my hands and wear a lot of different hats over the years between product design and engineer. I came to the VA as a contractor a couple years ago, where I worked on about half a dozen to a dozen different teams there, spanning a whole bunch of different products. And I made the leap to a full-time federal employee by joining the office of the CTO last summer. And since then, I have been a lead architect person thing, trying to reinvent the beneficiary travel for veterans from a technical and product standpoint.
That's great. Thank you, Mark. Dave?
Thank you and good afternoon. So I'm Dave Conlon. I've been in the federal service since late 2014 and with the Office of the CTO at Department of Veterans Affairs since late 2019. My focus at VA has really been on products within our modernized unauthenticated portfolio. So this includes the va.gov homepage, what we refer to as our benefits hubs for information for our beneficiaries about what services veterans and beneficiaries have earned through veteran service. as well as sites for our 140 VA medical centers, 300 and 300 vet centers. Recently, this past August, I moved to the role of product lead for the VA.gov platform. And so that's a new role for me that I'm very excited to explore.
Thank you and welcome. Amelia?
Hi, everyone. My name is Amelia Liarakos. I am a human-centered design and strategy specialist with the digital service at the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, otherwise known as CMS. I've been at CMS for almost 3 years now, working mostly in the Medicare space on the Medicare payment systems modernization and the larger oral health cross-cutting initiative that CMS is pursuing.
Thank you, Amelia. Ian?
Hi, everyone. I'm coming to y'all from XD at the director's office at Census. So XD is a small group of folks where we are exploring emerging technology. So we're thinking a lot about pilots and MVPs and prototypes mostly, because we are very much so on trying to find ways to get ahead of how we bring new types of technology into the government and other public services. So prior to this, I was working with Amelia over at CMS. I come from primarily a DevOps and engineering background.
Thank you, Ian. And Arabella?
Hi, I'm Arabella Crawford. I'm currently at USDS, background in human factors, information architecture, health information, trust, literature, literacy, plain language, things like that, which led me through a government journey of SSA, CMS, and now USDS. On paper, I'm a designer. I can't draw anything except boxes and lines, so more design as a tool for navigating complexity.
Thank you. I want to thank all of you for joining today. For the audience, as a follow-up to this webinar, we will provide you with ways to follow up with our panelists if you hear anything that sparks your curiosity. And with that, we'd love to know from our audience, which of these three, MVP, prototype, or pilot, have you come across or have used most often in your professional experience? We're opening up a Zoom poll. Please select your choice there, and we'll pause for about 10 to 15 seconds. Okay. I'm trying to figure out how we can see the results. Wow, so it seems kind of evenly distributed, with MVP being the highest. 77% of you mentioned MVP that you've come across most often, and others are above 60%. So a lot of wide, diverse experience in our panelists as well as audience. That's great. We'll get started with the questions. So the first question that I want to raise to our panelists is, how would you define these terms? How would you define a prototype, pilot, and MVP? We'll start with Mark.
Well, thank you. Yeah, let's get this going strong out of the gate. So a lot of my experience with this, with a prototype, pilot, and MVP has been from an engineering perspective. So I kind of look at it from that way. And really, I see it as almost three different stages of a product. Prototype, MVP, and then pilot. Prototype is the bare minimum, I hacked this thing together in a week and that solves a problem, but I need to stand on my head and turn around 3 times to get it to work. What this does, this really solves the problem and proves the concept that it works. This is really awesome because you need it for stakeholder buy-in. You need it to actually say, hey, we can actually build this product. The MVP, this is the first thing that's actually sort of polished enough to put in front of the user, friends and family preview, but it actually is this is the product that works inside of the ecosystem. It's not fully featured, it's not feature ready, it's not complete by any means, but it's ready enough to actually be used. Now, pilot, This is actually like the first kind of controlled release of the product into the wild. I say controlled release because there's a lot of metrics need to be defined around it. A/B testing, it is extremely monitored from afar. But this is actually like running a pilot, running your app through this pilot phase is the actual like, hey, this is out there. Not so much ready to go, but it's out there enough that for users to solve the products and solve the problems on their own. Many opinions there, but that's kind of like a high level kind of setting the stage here.
Yeah, thank you for that, Mark. Amelia, do you want to add something to that?
Yeah, so I think I have a similar set of definitions, maybe slightly broader, coming from just like a design background. For me, a prototype is really part of an experiment that tests a hypothesis with the aim to learn something. So you're rigging up in whatever fidelity makes sense, an aspect of the product or service that you want to learn something about. So this could be content, it could be technology and coding languages, it could be information architecture, an interface. You can prototype environmental wayfinding, so how you move through a space. You can prototype procedures and process, branding and marketing, anything where you have like, I need to understand how this works against a certain set of people, and I want to understand more about it or something about it. For me, there should never really be an expectation that a prototype itself ends up in production. However, the learnings from it should be. And a prototype itself might not meet all the human or business needs. You're really trying to scope it down to something that is testable, and to scope it to something to learn that specific thing you're trying to learn, and hopefully build up a series of prototypes towards a larger understanding of something. A pilot is really, to me, a discrete period of time where you're sort of assessing the effectiveness of a feature or product, a service, again, whatever you're trying to test. And you've kind of launched it into production against some set of goals. And you're either serving that to your whole user base or a subset of your user base. And so, I think, like Mark said, the organization needs to set a lot of definition around the effectiveness and what effectiveness means and how we're going to measure it. What are those leading indicators? I think there's generally like a go, no-go decision at the end of that. Like, yes, we're going to keep it out there. No, we're going to take it back. No, we need to iterate on it more. But you're really trying to look at whether you want to fund it long-term, and just generally support it long-term. So I would think something in pilot is more at the production fidelity. And, things like doing a beta is like a type of piloting, right? Yeah. And then for MVP, I think this is more like just the smallest set of features or process that you can launch to production as sort of like a cohesive whole or unit that someone can use and that meets a human need. So really like making sure we include viable in the definition of MVP. And the underlying goal with this is getting something like useful, usable, and desirable out as fast as possible to get that data at scale, right? You want real people using the thing as soon as possible. And the intention with this is to support and evolve the product long term, but kind of start small and iteratively grow so that you can pivot that as you're going. But in my opinion, like all of these things are just different types of methods to gather data at different scales to help the business or organization make a decision towards a desired outcome, right? Like an organization is essentially making bets on anything that they build. And where it wants to put money and resources behind something. So the more and different and useful types of data you can collect, the less risky your bet becomes. And the more confident you should be in what you're releasing and how it's going to work in the real world.
Right. I loved what you said about for prototype not having an expectation that will make it to prod, but the learnings should definitely be taken out of that. Just in the spirit of all of these different stages have learnings that come out of them. I'd like to ask Arabella if you want to add something.
Yeah, I'm probably even broader because that's the design thing, right? I definitely don't think of these. So we use them in a digital world. That doesn't make them digital specific, right? And I don't think of them that way because I think the minute you narrow it down to that, things become more contentious, right? And you have to have more specificity around it, right? Prototype covers every form of design, architect. Like there's so many worlds in which you do it as a learning tool, right? It's an exploration. A failure in a prototype is not a failure. Like how do you fail a prototype, right? If you learn something, you do something. Pilot, I know in this conversation, right, we're assuming it's at the end of the line, but I think of these things all as slightly different shapes, right? Prototype is like just really fuzzy, like you're going to do a thing, you're going to learn a thing, and you can prototype, paper prototypes, right? In usability testing, that's a real thing. We used to do them. I've done them, right? It's real. You put it out, you learn something. The fidelity doesn't matter, right? You've done that. Pilot is something that's real enough to put out into the world in some form, right? But that's part of what it is. We used to pilot usability tests, right? You've made it, you put it out, you learn, it's good enough that you think you're good to go, but you just need like one round to figure out and see what did we not get. MVP is the one that for me is really different. It's a different shape from the others, right? Because it assumes that you've got something large enough that you're not going to build and release the entire thing and put it all out at one time. And you need to be able to put something small. If you're doing architecture or something, you don't do that. Like you don't MVP the building, right? To me, MVP is very digital specific in that way of like, we've got this big plan, we've got this large scale thing, but the MVP fits. So it's a different, I don't know if that's a good enough word. It's a different shape from the other two for me. The others like get used in the real world in different ways. They have very clear questions that they kind of answer in places they fit. And MVP has this much more digital specific piece to it.
Yeah, I'm a visual person as well. And when you talk about shapes, that totally makes sense to me. I also want to ask how we think about these three terms in terms of different dimensions. So what are the primary objectives? And we touched upon some of these aspects, but in terms of what are the size of features? What are the target users? What kind of user involvement do you expect from each of these states? I would love to touch on those. Well, let's go with Ian, if you can add something on that.
Sorry, struggling with my telephone. So I think in regards to sort of size and sort of level, I do think that pilots and prototypes can be much more, can and should be much tighter, much more focused, much smaller, much more like, even as short as like 6, 12, 18 weeks, something where you can really quickly, rapidly understand. Whereas like an MVP, that feels more, that's going to be real. And so that could have a much broader impact or scope, I think. So pilots and prototypes could be things that have like technology that isn't even really proven yet, pre 1.0 stuff, where you're really trying to test the waters and understand what a potential impact might be. Whereas, you'd hope that you'd have at least 1.0 in an MVP type world where you're trying to capture, say, some meaningful portion of your target audience, so that you really can get that A/B blue-green type of information out of that viability. So I think that kind of is where I start to think about the difference between something that really is, beta versus something that is going to be used by a meaningful number of people. If that helps sort of like think about the size or scope or stretch of what this landscape sort of feels like to me.
Yeah. Yeah, I want to open it up to all the panelists, and I also want to bring in another dimension, which is important to us, contractual obligation in digital services. So if anybody can speak to that in terms of these three different concepts or any other of the dimensions that we have mentioned.
So building on what Amelia was talking about earlier, I look to each of these definitions around the outcomes and measurements we're trying to wrap our head around. What experiments are we trying to run? What are we trying to learn from each of these different stages? And when we're talking about prototype, we are looking to fail early, fail fast sort of a scenario. And that's a great position to be in, and to be able to set up the contracts and not even just contracts, but expectations with the product teams of it is okay to fail as long as we learn from it. And that's that focus on learning, that focus on being able to pivot is incredibly important to each of these different stages. I look to the pilot areas as different dimensions of what are you trying to pilot. Some of the experiences I personally try to create are both from an editor standpoint as well as a veteran facing standpoint, and those are two very different experiences that I'm trying to navigate, of threading that through a business process, learning capabilities, and then veteran outcomes, and experimenting with each of those at different fidelity levels and piloting these things at different levels simultaneously.
Yeah, that's wonderful. I want to move to the next question, and we'll continue with you, Dave. Can you share a real-world example of a prototype, pilot, or MVP from your experience, and any interesting learnings from that?
So I can compare two different pilots that we did. So we had a VA medical center. So VA has 140 medical centers composing over 3,000 facilities throughout the US. We're the largest integrated healthcare in the country. And we also have 300 vet centers. I inherited a product at MVP and pilot for the VA medical centers. And the pilot was a data point of 1, which was not a good idea. That is a lesson that we learned because there was not enough data gathered for moving forward. So moving this into what we had assumed was MVP was not quite MVP, and making those pivots with a limited amount of data based upon the bets that we made as to what MVP was. And as we moved into pilot, it was very challenging. And a lot of this dealt with, arguably, in my opinion, too large of a scope. And so as we moved into a different type of product, the VA medical centers, we made sure to keep our scope of that product for MVP incredibly narrow, really 2 features: where are they located and what services they offer, besides all of the bells and whistles that a lot of stakeholders and veterans will want out of that product in the future with a lot of value, but keeping it very, very tight. And then also looking and having our pilot group of 10 vet centers, so that as we rolled this out, both from an editor standpoint and to our veterans, to be able to learn how they're interacting with this in both usability sessions as well as in the real world, to be able to understand and make those pivots as we then rolled it out into larger chunks of that MVP and then additional features to that larger 300 audience.
I love what you mentioned about data. I think Amelia earlier also mentioned that defining what metrics you want out of these stages is really, really important. And that seems to be one of the key learnings. And also how users are interacting with the limited features and then building up on that. I know Mark has worked on some of these as well. So can I bring you in, Mark?
Yeah, sure. So currently we're looking at piloting new ways for veterans to submit something called travel benefits. I'll save the boring what that is for the side, but it's pretty much, it's an extra process that veterans have to go through during their healthcare experience. And currently, the current system is, I will say, rough, because I think that's as worse as I can say in a setting such as this. So we're looking at how can we change that. So whenever I joined a year ago, we looked at how can we started with the theory of how can we improve this, and that really drove what could happen. But really, the prototype of that theory was, hey, we need to turn this old clunky system into an API. So the prototype for the system was, hey, can we build some sort of RESTful API that allows us to submit this travel claim, and that's it. Great. We learned a lot of things. We learned technologically, we learned a lot of things, such as it's okay if the first version of the API sucks. I don't know if I can say sucks, so I'm saying it anyways. And that's kind of the beauty of the whole prototype process, is that it doesn't have to be this like gleaming perfect thing that's shipped day one. In fact, if it is this perfect gleaming shiny thing that you're shipping day one, you've waited too long. You've waited too long to get feedback. You've waited too long to get it tested on wild to see what's going on. So we took this rough prototype wrapped it up and threw it into an MVP that we associated it with patient check-in. And we did the development work on that, worked through the integration problems, some technical issues here and there. Really, we were able to run our first pilot at a facility that allows veterans to submit these claims during the check-in process, which is awesome. And the way that we did that is it was very much defined up front, like, hey, we want veterans to do this. This is a brand new process, a brand new experience. We weren't sure what the reception was going to be, or even what those numbers or usage numbers that we wanted to do. Like, hey, we couldn't say we want 75% of veterans to use this because we had no data really to kind of like lean on. So this was more of an exploratory pilot to help gather those numbers. So with that success, we're rolling it out to a bigger audience now. So now that we're rolling out to a bigger audience, we now have that initial pilot numbers to really compare this next pilot on, which I think is a very big one and a very interesting point of the piloting process, is that it's repetitive and iterative, and the next pilot should always be based off the last one to help kind of fuel it in this, pardon the phrase, a blockchain of pilots, so to speak.
Yeah, makes sense. Amelia, do you have any examples you can share?
Sure. So on the Medicare payment system modernization program that I worked on, we did a prototype of a modern architecture for the Medicare payment systems as sort of just like an experiment in a learning process around what would a North Star look like if we could start from scratch, and knowing what we know about some of the pain points with the current system and some of the, new and emerging healthcare policy that's coming down the pipe. How would we actually approach this now? How would we figure out how to actually design an architecture and things like that? So some of the things we learned about were, what we knew and we didn't know about the systems by sort of defining the edge of this prototype scope. By going through this process, we sort of came across things where we're like, well, we know this is here, but we know it's kind of big, and we know we don't really have access to the people we would need to do this right, and it would take a really long time. So we're going to leave that out of scope, but we know it's something we need to get to later in order to develop confidence for this thing. So we were able to sort of better understand where the edges of our knowledge were. We also were able to devise a fairly repeatable process for sort of breaking down policy into a data model, and then making system architecture decisions based on those organization and customer needs, in conjunction with that data model. So being able to look at, like, how would we then do this again in the future for something different, or a different part of this larger system that we needed to look at. And I think ultimately our biggest learning was that there was really no single technical or design decision that would solve all of the internal and external pain points that we had uncovered through the years of research previous to that. We really needed to look at a holistic approach to create that foundation to fulfill our use case. So really looking across all the layers of like data, architecture, and technologies that we were using in order to try to solve those meaningfully at scale.
Yeah. There are some questions from the audience, so I just want to say that we'll leave some time in the end for the questions as well, but there's one that we touched upon a little bit that I want to bring in, which is about proof of concept. So is proof of concept, or which of these three shapes is closest to the proof of concept, and is proof of concept a synonym for one of these? Arabella, you talked about some of that. If you want to add some more thoughts.
Sure.
There.
I mean,
Could we do another Zoom poll?
This is just opinion, right? But I always I'm thinking of these in terms of questions, right? Proof of concept is the broadest to me of all of these, right? Prototype is also very broad. Proof of concept, like, what are you proving and what concept are you proving it on? I don't think it becomes a synonym until you know that. Because if the proof of concept is that this thing works for this audience, like, I'm not using, I understand that proof of concept has a terminology and a place, but I think it's one of those things that's very broad, and you have to know what you're proving and where for it to fit. So I don't think but it's probably closest to prototype. right, in that way. I was going to follow just quickly onto what Amelia was saying about the prototype real world piece. Can I do
Sure.
that?
Yes.
If I gave
Let's
a good
do it.
enough answer, or should somebody else answer the proof of concept question? Whichever one works.
I think we can come back to that. If there are further questions on this, we can come back, but
Okay.
I'd love to hear your thoughts on it.
Yeah, so the reason so we both worked on this, so we're talking about the same thing, but in government, so if this is about government, and I'm interested actually in the next comment that was made about this idea of a pilot and the prototype being some features. That to me is a very enterprise world set of understandings, right? When you're working in these gigantic, messy, mostly legacy systems, the idea that you are prototyping at a point where you already understand what the features are is really super downstream. And I will admit, I live my life and I'm happiest in the part where like we have absolutely no idea what's going on, where any of the features are going to be, right? But I'm interested in like something like prototype fits there. And that's why this particular prototype was super interesting. And we learned so many things that were unexpected, and you could not have predicted what you were going to learn, in the same way that when you do really open user research, right? And you really go out and you ask not a set of specified detailed questions that are like in a survey format, but just like, tell us about your experience with this thing. You're going to learn stuff you didn't expect to learn. Prototype does that. And it has a very unique place in something like government, where you're trying to understand something at scale, where you're not able to say, here's the product, here's the business case, here's the whatever, because you're still trying to understand the problem. And prototyping, I think, does have a role in helping understand a problem and all of the edges of it, and lots of different types of problems, not just technological ones, not just architectural ones, not just data ones, right? And that was one of the most, I don't know if I should, I learned so much from that experience, right? That I now reuse in how I think about the idea of what it takes to rethink or reimagining something at that scale in this kind of world.
Great, thanks. And you had mentioned scope there, and I wanted to use that as a chance to kind of jump into our next question of when planning a pilot, prototype, or MVP, how do you determine the scope, and how do you mitigate the eventual scope creep? Perhaps we could start with Dave.
Thanks, Josh. Yeah, so this is where at VA I feel a little bit on the spoiled side, in that everything we do, we are able to map back to veteran outcomes, right? And, we are a very mission-driven organization, and we're able to really push back and collaborate with folks in human-centered design, talking to veterans, talking to beneficiaries, and really mapping to those outcomes, right? And so in a way, we're very spoiled as to define, like, what are all of the things that could be scope, right? When we actually get down to defining the scope and mitigating eventual scope creep, this is where I think for me, it's not only just a partnership with our stakeholders, but also for folks on the development teams as well. So one of the sayings that I'm famous for, a little bit tongue in cheek at VA, is it's nice to want things. And I encourage people to use that phrase across the board. Right? I encourage developers to question, Dave, is that actually something that is MVP? My product managers do the same thing, or me to push on them, to not have that sense of hubris of Dave knows all things, or because Dave is the customer, or what have you, is really to facilitate that conversation and pull in all of those perspectives to get a very holistic, tight scope that everyone can sort of buy into and hold each other accountable. Now, the one gotcha there, especially when working on contracts and stuff along those lines, is I trust that the vendors and the teams that we work with are not trying to use this as a business development opportunity or what have you, right? And I can say that solidly, I've not encountered that, but I know that there are folks, especially on my stakeholder side of the fence, get a little bit nervous when I mention something of being pulled in by one of the developers or a vendor or something along those lines, that in a sense the hackles can get up. And so my role on product is to kind of smooth all of that out, but really to establish that front to back of the house trust relationship, and buy into defining what that really tight scope is, and also to prevent that type level of creep.
Thanks, Dave. And as a site-wide crew member, fully bought into the "it's nice to want things" mantra. Let's see. Anything else to add on to that question, Ian?
Yeah, I mean, I think once you think you know your scope, maybe just take a few things and chuck them out, because there's always going to be those unknowns that will find their way into your process. And so always having a bit of capacity to be able to accommodate those types of unknown like things that are going to come up. And I think, time boxing is also super important, because even if you have a very good scope and an understanding of everything, sometimes you do just have to create some structure and deadlines around when things need to be where they should be, to help drive the right things, because you really just need to actually get to a delivery at some point, So being like firm on that and really driving towards actually shipping is super important. And I think to speak to Dave's comment a bit about that contract side, defining those objectives can be can be difficult. And making sure that you are finding the right things that will make the contract successful and make the team successful and make all the stakeholders excited and happy with the effort. There's definitely a lot of tension in that whole ballpark.
Yeah, I love what you said about time boxing. I think it's been very essential for some of the projects that I've worked in to kind of make sure that we are not letting the scope creep too much. And with that, I want to actually ask the panel, what defines a successful outcome for prototype, pilot, or MVP? I'll start with Arabella.
What defines successful one? For me, it's the prototype's the easiest, right? Because if you learn something, you're successful. I think that's a given. This is the messy balance, right? Between who has to be successful and in what way, right? My answer is always going to be a researchy answer, right? If we learn something that we can make it better and we can move it forward, to me, that's success. This is why I'm not a product person. This is why I'm not going to be a business owner, right? Because being able to meet that level of criteria, and Ian just described it, right? Like, it's the tension between those two things. Putting something out in government, particularly, right, in front of the audience that is like the citizens of the US, and having it not work has really serious, severe, real consequences that are more than just our product like lost money or something, right? Like, there are very real, serious consequences for people. So thinking through what is an MVP in that world, what is a pilot in that world, I think is really, it is different, right? It's where that's why the fail fast and often doesn't work quite as well for us, right? Because there's a different level for failure. But right. I'm going to stick with the safe answer of the prototype one, being that, like, you learned what you do next. Prototype assumes iteration, right? So as long as you learned what you're going to do next, you've learned something, and that is a success. And I'll be honest, like, the more we do of that, the less you fail when you get to the other two.
Yeah. And I think it also highlights the importance of really defining what you want to achieve as part of each of these stages. I want to go to Amelia if you want to add something.
Yeah, so totally agree with what Arabella said about a prototype. I mean, that's what I had in the back of my mind, is if you've learned something about whatever you were trying to learn And even better, if you learn something you weren't anticipating, then your prototype has essentially been successful. And then hopefully you're using that information to inform another prototype or the actual product. And it should, like raise or lower your confidence in whatever idea that you're testing. So it should tell you something useful. I think so. If it hasn't done that, then you didn't scope your experiment right, or you didn't scope your prototype right. And you need to think about like how you would do differently the next time. But with a pilot, I think looking at gathering enough information to make that informed decision about whether you're supporting this thing long term, you're launching it to a full user base, anything like that. So having those measurements that you're using for that be meaningful, that they actually represent the desired behavior change that you're looking for, the outcome. And then making sure that you gather enough data to be statistically significant. So you don't want to just pilot a thing for 2 days and you got like 3 people to use it. Like that's not good. But you might pilot a thing for 3 days and get 100,000 people to use it, and then you have a nice set of data to actually make a good decision off of. And then for MVP, for me, I think, like meeting a human need and validating or invalidating that with data. So being able to put it out there and get that real world feedback, having those feedback mechanisms in place to continuously iterate, and having areas where you plan to explore and iterate on next. So having that sort of roadmap planned out of where you choose to experiment and build and ideate through next, so that you can figure out where you're putting your bets and your money, and work through building or lowering confidence in those.
I love what you said about one of the outcomes of MVP being the areas that you want to explore next. So there's no preset path, or even if you have a preset path, that might change based on the outcomes of the MVP.
Yeah, I think the minute you get into like, here's the 16 other things we're going to go build right after this, it's less of an MVP. If you can keep it, like you might have ideas for what those things are, but if you could keep it as areas of exploration under which you have these ideas that you want to explore, then you're keeping more of that MVP mentality, and it allows you to pivot later.
Yeah. Mark, what defines a successful prototype, pilot, or MVP to you?
Well, that's a really good question. I think the other two are really good answers with that. And I'm going to echo a lot of what they said around like how you define a successful prototype, pilot, or MVP is always circling back to that original question or the original theory or the original problem that you were looking to solve. I wanted to build a prototype that solves this problem. I wanted to iterate on this business process. I have a theory that if we change X, Y, and Z, it'll make it 20% faster. I think if you can get those answers and those metrics and those kind of ideas to always go back to why the hell we started this whole thing, I think that's what causes us success. And whether it's, hey, my theory was right, hey, my theory was wrong, like no matter what, I think that failing is also part of the successful process as well. Because knowing what not to do and the direction not to go often reveals where you should go or what you should be doing. So, yeah.
Yeah.
Can I just pile onto that a little bit? I think that, even if you have a prototype that was a failure, it's often easy to find or harvest concepts or ideas or patterns even out of those efforts that you can then apply in different ways, So I think it's not always just win fail. There's always kind of a lot of ways that you can take something that didn't go the way you thought it might, or may have opened other doors, and just take parts of it that did work, and harvest some of those like partial successes and make those actually reusable, successful wins out of like some of that quick prototype work. Because I've seen that a lot. You think you're trying to solve a particular business pattern by doing some kind of lift and shift re-architecture work, and you discover that you've built and created patterns that you can apply across a lot of other types of problem spaces that you just have, that you just harvested out of a work effort that was totally for something else, So it's always good to keep an eye out for those components that you can then reuse or apply in other ways. So it's, there's always like opportunities, I think, to find success even in some of the like less exciting work that's out there. So always look for the apples you can pick up off the ground rather than shaking the tree.
And just to add to that, Ian, this is one of the areas of opportunity that VA has, and I think other areas of government have, is we're huge. We don't have visibility into all of these experiments and all of these lessons. And so finding ways across the organization to have those learning experiences and share those learning experiences are incredibly important to us. And having contractors to help support and share those lessons is incredibly important.
Thanks. And I think that leads into our next question. Can you describe a challenge you faced in transitioning from a prototype to an MVP or from a pilot to a full rollout? And let's stick with you, Dave.
I kind of spoke to this one a little bit earlier, is the inheritance of the earlier pilot that was a little bit larger in scope than, in my opinion, we could have. So we were trying to answer too many questions as part of that pilot, and too many. We were trying to have our fingers in too many pies and understand the different outcomes. And as a result, we almost for all intents and purposes, we ended up in a bit of analysis paralysis. We didn't know what to actually execute on, or what, and that signal to noise ratio kind of thing in order to be able to unstick this and move forward. So we found a couple of areas that we were able to move forward on, but it did cause tension in terms of what we had originally deemed as success for the MVP and pilot, as well as being able to iterate and really flesh out to what Amelia was talking about earlier, those areas of investigation that we wanted to explore later. And so it was very challenging during that whole process for us. And we, in a way, we still struggle with some of that to this day with that product as a result.
Nice. It sounds like good learnings from that, even though it was challenging, and kind of harking back to what we talked about with narrow scope and ensuring that, focus there. Amelia, did you have anything to add there?
Yeah, so I can go back to my real world example as well with the payment system modernization prototype. And I really want to talk about challenges in doing prototyping in an organization that's not really set up for or bought into doing these like continuous learning cycles, which is often what you find in government. Government just hasn't been set up for that for the longest time. And there's reasons for that. There's challenges from the program manager perspective that we need to keep in mind as we try to do these things in government. You have to do things like budget justifications where, delivered product is more meaningful than just learning a bunch of stuff. And so, that's just kind of how it works right now. So a lot of people feel pressure to actually make sure that these types of activities lead to some sort of delivery or some sort of product. And this can, be challenging when you try to do prototyping. So, for example, with the prototype of the modern architecture of the payment systems, we did it with the intention of pitching more prototyping should the learning of this be promising. We wanted to try this thing out to try to adjudicate a claim end to end in the cloud and just see what we could learn from that. But we had a kind of very project-oriented delivery mentality that we had to work with in our stakeholder groups. There are stakeholders who weren't really used to throwing things away once you've learned something. We weren't used to or comfortable championing learning as a positive outcome. So, and we knew people would expect the prototype to kind of do all of these things that the current payment systems do, and that we would learn all the things from this one prototype, and that some of it would be like actually physically reusable later in some way. And so that made it kind of hard to set scope in a way that satisfied all of these things. So we needed to try to build enough to like catch the interest of stakeholders and have it be meaningful enough to them to, allow us to do follow-on work if we wanted to pursue that. But we also wanted to learn useful things about different technologies we could potentially use, the processes, the rules, the policy around this, the business functions, et cetera. And on top of this, I think like Arabella mentioned, we kind of had like a vague notion of how we wanted to go about doing this. There wasn't like some magic framework that we could follow and that we could use to sort of chart out like step by step, this is how this is going to go. And so that made it harder to sort of plan and proactively communicate. And in the end, we elected for kind of like a bigger scope so that we could tell a better story in the end, which meant that it took a lot longer than you'd really want a prototype to take. And that, amongst other things, sort of impacted its overall reception. And we didn't end up actually doing more prototyping after this, even though, I sort of tried to pitch this idea of like a learning roadmap and like, here's all the other areas, the edges we didn't get to, and all these other places where we could go do prototyping to sort of build up this idea. So we ended up stopping there. And so, like, hindsight 2020, if I was to do things differently, I think I'd try to build more support for like a period of experimentation, again, with sort of like a learning roadmap of things that are in and out of scope, and learning and experimenting towards these different areas, and sort of adjusting that roadmap as we learn. And that way we could sort of scope things down and look at smaller things to present and communicate more often, and have more discussion internally about what this means and what we're learning. And this is, I think, especially important and useful in complex contexts like the Medicare payment systems. It's like one of the most complex policy and system spaces in government. So you like literally can't prototype all the aspects of the product or system in one go. And so we need to figure out how to scope that down and do smaller increments and be able to like proactively, continuously communicate that out in a way that's meaningful to stakeholders.
Yeah, I love that you brought the complexity. It kind of goes back to the different dimensions of these three terms that we were discussing, and complexity of the project definitely plays a big role in these. Just a time check, we have about 8 minutes. I want to get to one more question quickly, and then go to audience questions as well. And this question is important, especially in the government space. How do you allocate resources and budget for prototypes? Is that any different for prototypes, pilots, or MVPs? We'll start with Arabella.
So I'm going to think about prototypes and this idea of safety, right? So if government is large and messy, and the bar for getting things wrong like really has serious and real impacts, right? Prototypes are the one place where you actually can do something, produce something, test something, make it real, but it's safe, right? There's you're not you're not releasing it, it's not going out in the wild, right? You can play with it. And I would say I would always advocate for expertise, time, right, as the major resources that you put into something like that, rather than 2 years spent defining requirements for something that may or may not work, that we are then going to write a multi-million-dollar contract for to someone and hope, fingers crossed, that we got it right. I'm being a little, right, but this is sort of how it happens, right? Because the safe thing in a lot of these types of pieces of work is to talk about it first, right? You have to talk about it. Then you can get to the part where you start building and you do the MVP and you do the pilot, because you're going to make it real and you've got to get it out there. And I would say one of the things that I am never in a position to actually allocate resources, right? I'm not talking like a project manager, but I just want to talk about the balance of resources. And if you're going to prototype something, try and learn from it, try and get as much out of it, right? The allocation of time and expertise and availability to information and research to be able to do that, right? Versus what you put into something like an MVP and prototype seems like something worth looking at and considering if you really want to learn important and valuable things from it.
Right.
Probably not the answer you were looking for. You should ask somebody like, is that write a budget for this?
Yeah, it's always tricky to allocate budget and resources for any of these. I want to give Ian the last word. Ian, what can you add to that?
In a sentence, I think you want to you allocate resources and budget and people towards what's working. So find what's working and use that as your, where you can build momentum.
Okay, very cool. Thank you. We have some audience questions.
Yeah,
John?
Martha Wilkes had a question in chat. She said, how do you balance working on an MVP mindset versus keeping the quality level high?
So who can talk about quality when it comes to these? How do you balance the mindset of having an MVP and putting something out there quickly versus keeping a high quality bar?
I'll go with something first. So I think that, first off, great question. That is always a constant struggle of like, how much do we polish this before we kick it out the door? And I'll go back to like, if it's too polished, we waited too long. But really, there is a iterative approach to that. I know at the VA, we do a lot of research. We're front heavy on getting the veteran involved. We're front heavy on ally and accessibility. We're front heavy on like all these really important ideas. And all they do at the end of the day is add scope, which is kind of like the opposite of what prototyping and MVP would actually kind of work on. So there really is this iterative approach to how you get to that quality. And just to say it, just because you have a working MVP in your like staging environment doesn't mean that you're releasing that as soon as it's done into the wild. There is this kind of like limbo where we have a product that's built and ready to go. What do we need to do before we ship it in 10 days or whatever?
Yeah, thank you. And I do want to say, I mean, Dave and Amelia also touched on this, that quality, the quality bar has to be really high for some of the projects, especially working with VA and other departments. And sometimes there isn't an option to put something out there that is not ready. So that's the balance that we always have to make. We have concluded the question and answer part. I want to thank all the panelists for being here today and sharing with us your experience and expertise.